Hi, suppose you're trying to find a bug in a process that calculates employees' salaries. You toggle a breakpoint where you think what causes the bug is, and you start debugging. And then you get to this line of code. What does it do? In order to answer that question, you'll probably need to understand what MGRLS is used for. And for that, you'll have to find the last time a value was assigned to it, assuming the code there is clear. If not, you'll have to read along until you understand that variable's meaning. But the problem doesn't end there. From now on, every time you'll encounter MGS, you'll have to remind yourselves what it contains, and you'll have to do that while trying to understand a probably complex logic, while you follow variables' values throughout the code, and so on. Now, suppose instead of that line, you have this line. Now you can just read the code and understand it without looking for its meaning elsewhere, or remembering things. In this lesson, we'll learn how to create variables' names that will make your code easy to understand. Suppose you work on a feature that will enable employees to set appointments with each other. For that, you have a class name meeting. Now suppose you want to name the property that holds the value of when the meeting is scheduled to. Would you name it just time? Let's see. The name time is very generic. When someone who isn't familiar with your feature will see a field with that name, she won't know if it means the time the meeting was scheduled, when it actually occurred, and so on. This name is not specific enough, which means it is not a good choice. The first rule in naming is that names should convey the meaning in the clearest way possible, and a name that can be interpreted in more than one way is not clear. How about date and hour? Same problem. You can't figure out date and hour of what. So a good name for it would be starts at. That conveys the meaning in a clear way. But what about meeting starts at? Isn't that clearer? The answer is no. Since the variable is already in a class named meeting, it's obvious that it refers to it, and so adding that to its name is just noise. Likewise, adding its type and calling it starts at date is usually noise, although in some languages, in some scenarios, it does make sense. Which leads us to the second rule in naming. Names should be as short as possible. Note that we apply this rule only after we applied the first one. That is, names should convey the variable's meaning in the clearest way possible, and given that, they should also be the shortest possible. So, first clarity, then brevity. Let's see another example. Suppose a part of the hiring process in an employee's management application you build is completing a technical test, and that you should store the test score in a variable inside a candidate class. Take a look at the following suggestions. Which of them do you think is the best name for that variable? So, since a candidate may get a score for other parts of the hiring process, naming the variable just score or grade is not clear enough. Score of what? Grade of what? So we can rule out those two. Since we're in the candidate class, mentioning that in the variable's name is redundant. So we're now left with test score and test grade. How should we choose? The answer is, we'll choose according to the terms already used by the system. So if the code that manages the tests in the application uses the term score, we'll name our variable test score, and if it uses grade, we'll name it test grade. Likewise, if we want to build a function that gets some records from the database, and we consider the names getRecords or fetchRecords, we'll go with whatever is already in use for getting or fetching other records. So we've now discovered the third rule in naming, and that is be consistent. The next point I want to make about naming is this. Suppose you want to name a variable for the employee's count in some class. What do you think about this name? Here, you can't say the variable's name is unclear. It's clear that it means the employee's count. It's just abbreviated. So, is this a good name? In order to answer this question, we'll have to understand what is happening when someone reads that variable's name. When someone reads that name, what's going on in his head is translating that name to something readable. They actually read it to themselves as employees count. They do that at least at first, in order to understand the variable's meaning. But usually, they'll do it every time they encounter that variable, because that's how the mind can grasp it. The mind needs a readable name. And so, using an abbreviation adds to the mental burden whoever reads your code is already under. So, the fourth rule of naming is, since you will read variables' names to yourself, and perhaps to others, names should be pronounceable. The last thing you should know about naming is that each language has its own conventions for each type of variable. And sometimes there is more than one convention, which means the team gets to pick its own convention. For instance, a class property may or may not begin with a capital letter. A const may or may not include underscores. These vary depending on the language you use and the conventions in your team. So definitely check those out. So here are the 5 rules we learned about naming. Rule number 1. The name should convey the meaning in the clearest way. Rule number 2. The name should be minimalist. Rule number 3. Use consistent terms, both applicatively, grade score, and technically, get fetch from DB. Rule number 4. Use pronounceable names. And rule number 5. Use naming conventions. And that's all for this topic. I'll see you in the next lesson.